Morning. I would encourage all of you to open up to 2 Kings 21. We'll be spending quite a bit of time in the Old Testament this morning. 2 Kings chapter 21. As I look out here this morning, I notice there are quite a few empty spaces. That's to be expected after how many names Clint read off the list of people that were sick, the various illnesses. We need to make sure we keep all those people in our prayers. It always kind of comes around this time of year, but especially now with COVID kind of making another resurgence. I don't know why that thing just won't go away. But making another resurgence, other people out, which is various illnesses. There is quite a few people that are gone here this morning. There is, however, one couple that is here that after many months that have been gone, the Sandwoods being back with us, I think it's just such a breath of fresh air. So good to see them out with us. We've been talking to them. Everybody has throughout the last several months. But it's good to actually see them, to actually give them a socially distanced hug, which I'll let you be the judge of how that happens. But it's good to talk to them, good to see them. It's always good to be with them. They're a valued member of this church, and we look forward to having them here. And today is the day that they get to be back with us, and we're thankful for that. We're thankful for everybody that has been able to make it out here this morning. This Wednesday night, we're starting a brand new quarter. We started a new quarter a couple Sundays ago on church history. This Wednesday, we're starting a quarter that is hopefully not too depressing, although the title certainly indicates that it is. We're calling it The Agony of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is a very, very personal book. I think sometimes when we look at the minor prophets and major prophets for that matter, which one Jeremiah is one of, we tend to look just at the judgments, and they seem very similar. This is a judgment on this is a judgment on this, and it almost just seems borderline repetitive over and over again. We're talking about judgment, we're talking about destruction, all these different things. Jeremiah is a very personal book. And Jeremiah not only talks about the agony that he's going through in watching Jerusalem be destroyed, but also I would argue his own personal agony and seeing the people that he sees dragged off to exile. And so Jeremiah is a very personal book. It's a very applicable book, I think, in a lot of ways for us in today's world. What we won't get to talk about too much on Wednesday is the time period within which Jeremiah is being written. Jeremiah starts during the reign of Josiah, who by just about anybody's standard is probably top 5 kings of Judah and Israel. He's certainly one of the more famous ones. Josiah is known for his revival. It's a time of peace, it's a time of prosperity, which arguably makes Jeremiah's teaching even more sad. That he begins his prophesying in a period of great renewal, great rejuvenation, and he ends it in exile in a nation that he never wanted to be in the first place. And yet Josiah has all these different reforms. He has these periods of time where he just completely rejuvenates the nation of Judah. Top to bottom, every single thing, spiritual, religious, physical, economic, everything is top to bottom renewed. But what's probably more engaging or more interesting than all these reversals is the time period that he did it in. Josiah really stands at a kind of a giant among all the other kings, not just because of what he did, but also because of how he did it. Josiah had virtually no good example in his life to follow after. His dad was Amnon, who was arguably one of the worst kings of Israel, or Judah, even though he only reigns for a few short years. His grandfather Manasseh has this 30-plus year reign where it literally just says he did every single thing that you could do that was bad and made Judah sin worse than anybody else that was before him. He has this brief period of reconciliation at the end, which is great. But then Josiah's great-grandfather Hezekiah, one of those other great figures of Scripture. But Josiah occupies the king at a young age, 6 years old, and yet throughout his life he demonstrates these massive reforms towards God. Look at 2 Kings chapter 21, verse 1. We'll get into a little bit of Hezekiah here. 2 Kings chapter 21, starting in verse 1. It says, Now Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Hephzibah. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the abominations of the nations, which the Lord dispossessed before the sons of Israel. For he rebuilt the high places which Hezekiah his father had destroyed, and he erected altars for Baal and made an Asherah, as Ahab king of Israel had done, and worshipped all the host of heaven and served them. He built altars in the house of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, In Jerusalem I will put my name. For he built altars for all the host of heaven in the 2 courts of the house of God. He made his son pass through the fire, practiced witchcraft, used divination, dealt with mediums and spiritists. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Then he set the carved image of Asherah, which he had made in the house which the Lord had said to David and to his son Solomon, In this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. And I will not make the feet of Israel wander any more from the land which I gave their fathers, if they will only observe to do according to all which I have commanded them, and according to all the law which my servant Moses commanded them. A very horrible postscript on that, verse 9. But they did not listen. And Manasseh seduced them to do evil more than the nations whom the Lord destroyed before the sons of Israel. We mark sometimes Josiah's reign as king as being a period of reform. He takes all these really horrible things, he throws them out the window, he reinstitutes godly worship inside of Israel, or inside of Judah. But Manasseh can arguably be a person of great reform also. Because as you notice in 2 Kings chapter 21, not only is Manasseh just evil to the core, but he reinstitutes things that should have been done away with a long time ago. He reinstitutes idol worship, conferring Jeroboam had instituted. He does various things that Ahab had done a couple centuries before. He reinstitutes all these really horrible things to the point that in verse 9 it says that he seduced Israel, or seduced Judah. I don't know why I can't get that right. He seduces Judah to do more evil than even the nations that they dispossessed from Canaan during the time of Joshua. Manasseh is a horrible guy. And so Josiah is looking at all of this, and especially there in verses 7 and 8, he's looking at all of this and he's saying to himself, God made us a promise. God made us a promise. Number one, that if we walk with Him, we will stand forever. He will always bless us. As long as we're obedient to Him, there's that blessing. But the other side of that promise is, if we disobey God, we can expect swift punishment from Him. And that's the world that Josiah enters. That's the world that Josiah becomes king inside of as he's observing all these different things and noticing it. He then institutes these series of reforms that boil everything back to their most basic common principle. What does God want? What is God after? What is true temple worship about? What is true spirituality about? There's a passage in Jeremiah chapter 6 and verse 16 that I love, and I think epitomizes what Josiah was all about. When it says, stand by the ways and see and ask for the ancient paths, where the good way is, and walk in that, and then you will find rest for your souls. The last part of verse 16 says, but you're not going to do that. But I love how verse 16 says, the way to institute reform is to stand there, take a minute, and ask yourself, what are the ancient paths? What should we really be doing? We see this a little bit in our class on church history, hopefully, especially as we get farther and farther into history, that at some point you just have to stop and ask yourself, what does God want? Let's put all these other things to the side. Let's put all these opinions that we have, these prejudices, these ideas that we have about the Trinity and about church worship. Let's put all that to the side and just ask ourselves, what does God want? That's the power of reform, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why Josiah was so impactful in his time. Not only because he was willing and able to do that, but because he was willing to do it in the face of a whole lot of people who had a lot of vested interest in that not happening. Josiah stands above everybody else in instituting the power of reform when it is extremely unpopular to do so. But we have to do that from time to time. We have to do that as a nation. We have to do that as a church. We have to do that as individuals. We have to be willing to ask ourselves the hard questions. Like what? Well, I think there are some questions that we need to be asking ourselves, not only as an individual, but especially as a church. One of the questions we need to be asking is, where's the bad? Let's look at 2 Chronicles 34. Where is the bad in all this? Before we can start to institute the things that we need to be doing, we need to be asking ourselves, what do we need to get out of the equation first? And as Josiah is looking at these nations, you can see it takes place here in 2 Chronicles 34. He asks these questions. In 2 Chronicles 34, starting in verse 1, it says, Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. He did right in the sight of the Lord. He walked in the ways of his father David, and he did not turn aside to the right or to the left. For in the 8th year of his reign, while he was still a youth, he began to seek the God of his father David. And in the 12th year, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of the high places, the Asherim, the carved images, and the molten images. So 6 years after he starts to serve God, he then notices there's some things that we need to get out of this place. Verse 4, they tore down the altars of the Baals in his presence. The incense altars that were high above them, he chopped them down. Also the Asherim, the carved images, the molten images, he broke in pieces, and he ground to powder and scattered it on the graves of those who had sacrificed to them. Then he burned the bones of the priests on their altars and purged Judah and Jerusalem. Notice what he did. He didn't just tear down Baal and Asherah. He then dug up dead priest bones of pagan priests and burned them. Verse 6, in the cities of Manasseh, Ephraim, Simeon, as far as Naphtali, and their surrounding ruins, he also tore down the altars and beat the Asherim and the carved images and the powder, and chopped down all the incense altars throughout all the land of Israel. Then he returned to Jerusalem. You want to know why this is hard for him? Not only is it hard because it's intense intentionality, the idea that I'm going to go dig up some dead bodies and burn them as a symbol of the restoration of Judah. You know why that's hard? It's because the Baal and the Asherim are national deities of superpowers that are breathing down his neck. And what Josiah knows is not only do we need to get rid of these things, but if I do, it's going to make a lot of people really angry. But what Josiah recognizes as young as 6 years old is he recognizes that I need to get the nation of Judah right with God. And that includes, at the very beginning, getting out all these negative things that don't need to be in here. All these idols, all this pagan worship. We need to get rid of all that. But look at verse 8. Ask yourself where the good is. 2 Chronicles 34 and verse 8. It says, now in the 18th year of his reign, when he had purged the land and the house, keep in mind that happens all before he turns 24, he sent Shaphan the son of Azaliah and Messiah, the official of the city, Joah the son of Jehoahaz, the recorder, to repair the house of the Lord his God. We need to get things going here, he says. Verse 9, they came to Hilkiah the high priest and delivered the money that was brought into the house of God, which the Levites, the doorkeepers, had collected from Manasseh and Ephraim, and from all the remnant of Israel, and from all Judah and Benjamin and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Then they gave it in the hands of the workmen who had the oversight of the house of the Lord, and the workmen who were working in the house of the Lord used it to restore and to repair the house. They in turn gave the carpenters to the builders to buy quarried stone, timber for couplings, to make beams for the houses which the kings of Judah had let go to ruin. The men, verse 12, did the work faithfully, with foremen over them to supervise. Jahath, Obadiah, the Levites, the sons of Merari, Zechariah, Meshullam of the sons of the Kohathites, the Levites, all who were skillful with musical instruments. They were also over the burden bearers, supervised all the workmen from job to job. And some of the Levites were scribes and officials and gatekeepers. We need to do something about this, Josiah says. And once we get all of this negative stuff out of the way, after we get every single thing out of the equation that we don't need to be doing, now we need to get back to basics. Let's get the temple rebuilt. Which, by the way, when you look at a lot of the minor prophets, that's what a lot of them talk about. Haggai talks about rebuilding the temple. Hosea, rebuild the temple. Malachi, what is this temple worship that you have? It's not what I prescribe. All of it focuses on the temple. Let's get that going, Josiah says. And he even puts in these nuggets in verses 11 and 12 where he says that a lot of people that came before him, as great as they were, let it go to ruin. But look at verse 14. When they were bringing out the money which had been brought into the house of the Lord, Hilkiah the priest found the book of the law of the Lord given by Moses. Hilkiah responded and said to Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. He did all of this without even having this book. Hilkiah then gave the book to Shaphan, and Shaphan brought the book to the king and reported further word to the king, saying, everything that was entrusted to your servants they are doing. They have also emptied out the money which was found in the house of the Lord, and they have delivered it into the hands of the supervisors and the workmen. Moreover, Shaphan the scribe told me the king, saying, Hilkiah the priest gave me a book. Shaphan read from it in the presence of the king. And when the king heard the words of the law, he tore his clothes. And the king commanded Hilkiah, Ahikam the son of Shaphan, Abdon the son of Micah, Shaphan the scribe, and Isaiah the king's servant, saying, go inquire of the Lord for me, and for those who were left in Israel and Judah, concerning the words of the book which has been found. For great is the wrath of the Lord which has been poured out on us, because our fathers have not observed the word of the Lord to do according to all that is written in this book. There's 3 stages of Josiah's reforms. The very first stage that he has is he looks around and he says, what should we not be doing? That's where he gets out all the bad. Where's the bad that we should be doing? Let's get all that out of here. Second thing he does is, what should we be doing? Keep in mind, all this happens before he even finds the book of the law. He says the very first thing we need to be doing is we need to be restoring the temple. Let's get that underway. But what's the better? What's the better that I can be doing? That happens when he finds the book of the law. Because as he observes there in verse 21, we haven't been doing this type of stuff. We know that we needed to be doing this. We know that we needed to be taking care of this type of stuff, but we haven't been doing it. That's the better that we can do. Jump down to verse 29. The king sent and gathered all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. The king went up to the house of the Lord, and all the men of Judah, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the priests, the Levites, all the people, from the greatest to the least. And he read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant which was found in the house of the Lord. The king then stood in his place, and he made a covenant before the Lord to walk after the Lord, to keep his commandments, his testimonies, his statutes with all his heart, with all his soul, to perform the words of the covenant that are written in this book. Moreover, he made all who were present in Jerusalem and Benjamin to stand with him. So the inhabitants of Jerusalem did according to the covenant of God, the God of their fathers. Josiah removed all the abominations from all the lands belonging to the sons of Israel, and made all who were present in Israel to serve the Lord their God. And throughout his lifetime, they did not turn from following the Lord, God of their fathers. These are the things that Josiah did. The questions that he asks as he thinks about this period of reform and this restoration, what he needs to be doing is, number one, what do we not need to be doing? Taking care of that. What's the good that I need to be doing? Let's focus on the temple. Number three, let's all together make an agreement that we are going to serve God. I think sometimes when we talk about our worship and talk about our Christianity, our life with God, we tend to get the first two right and completely forget the third. For instance, we talk a lot in this building, we talk a lot in scriptures, we talk a lot in Bible studies, whatever it is. We talk a lot about not sinning. Get those things out of your life. Get those temptations. Get those things that are separating you from God. Get those things out of your life. We also talk about doing good things. Let's go to worship service. Let's go to read our Bible. Let's pray every single day. Let's do these types of things that we know we need to be doing. We very rarely get to the third, where we stand up with people of like-minded faith with intentionality and we say, no matter what happens, I'm going to stand for God. That's the better. And a true reform cannot take place unless you have all of those components. The reason for that is because compromise starts to get into the equation. Even partial compromise on obedience turns into full disobedience. And the moment that we allow those cracks to come in and we begin to say, okay, I believe in this and I'll allow this and I'll go to services, I'll read my Bible, I'll pray, I'll do these types of things. But if we don't take that next step, then compromise begins to enter the picture because we have not made a firm commitment to do God's will all over the place, everywhere, no matter what. And every single one of us, as an elder, as a deacon, as a preacher, as a Christian, as whoever you are, need to make that commitment. And so let's ask these questions in light of this. What questions should I be asking? Number one, where's the bad? Where's the bad in your life? And I'm not asking for a flood of people to come down to the front row confessing their sins. If that happens, that's fine. But that's not what I'm getting at here. We have, all of us, sins in our life that we need to root out. But I'm not really even asking about that this morning. I'm not asking you to look inside your soul and see the sins that are plaguing your life. Here's what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you this morning where the presence of temptation is in your life. The problem with a lot of these people was not just that they didn't want to sin. The problem was that they didn't want to do what God wanted them to do. They have no problem making two of these reforms and saying, we're not going to do those things, but the extra step they didn't make was how can we draw closer to God? And that only happens, ladies and gentlemen, when we remove the presence of temptation from our lives. Sometimes we say, well, I can stay friends with this person, or I can stay a part of this group, I can stay a part of this whatever, I can live here however I want to, because I have the strength to make sure that doesn't take me. And that's not always possible. You know, I think when you look at the comparison between two great men of Scripture, for instance, you have somebody like Daniel. In Daniel chapter 1, who makes a very declarative statement in this passage. I am not going to defile myself with the king's food. Now, other people around him looked at that and probably said, well, why are you making that type of stand? You can still eat the food and still maintain your integrity around everybody else. That wasn't what Daniel did. Daniel said, before anything else, I have set my mind to not contaminate myself with this food. And then you have somebody like David, who for whatever reason didn't go out to war with his fellow soldiers, who for whatever reason decided to wander up on top of his roof, and who for whatever reason decided to then inquire about a woman named Bathsheba, and then who for whatever reason decided to send her into his chamber, and then who for whatever reason decided to keep going down that chain of command that not only ended with the death of his son, but also the death of one of his mighty men. The bad is not always about the sin that's in our life. And some of us would look at that and say, well, I could be David, I could go up on my roof, and that's where I could cut it off. Maybe we should get rid of it before it gets to that stage. Get rid of the temptation that is in your life. In 1 Kings, the 8th chapter, for instance. 1 Kings chapter 8, starting in verse 37. I love in this dedication the temple scene where Solomon gets up and he has a lot of things to say. If you're ever interested in reading what a lot of renewal is about, look in 1 Kings chapter 8. For 1 Kings chapter 8, starting in verse 37, he talks about the nature of humanity as we approach God. And it's not always great. Sometimes we are not as holy as we should be. But in 1 Kings chapter 8, starting in verse 37, he says, if there's famine in the land, if there's pestilence, if there's blight, mildew, locust, grasshopper, and their enemy besieges them in the land of their cities, whatever plague, whatever sickness there is, whatever prayer or supplication is made by any man or by all your people Israel, each knowing the affliction of his own heart, and spreading his hands towards this house, then hear in heaven your dwelling place. Forgive and act and render to each according to all his ways, whose heart you know. For you alone know the hearts of all the sons of man. For they may fear you all the days that they live in the land which you have given to our fathers. I think what Solomon hits on here in 1 Kings chapter 8 is not just the physical worship that we sometimes give credence to. We think, okay, I'm going to come into the assembly of God and I'm going to make sure that these things are out of my life. I need to ask forgiveness for this type of stuff. But twice in 1 Kings chapter 8, Solomon hits on the idea that God knows your heart. And that sometimes we walk into assemblies and sometimes we open up the Bible and sometimes we open up our hearts towards God in prayer and we're willing to get rid of these sins and ask forgiveness for that, but we're really not willing to purge that temptation out of our life. And so then the question comes up of whether or not I really want to be rid of that sin at all. Because if I really want to be rid of that sin, then I would take some of those extreme measures that Jesus talks about. I do not believe for whatever reason or by any means that you need to start cutting off hands and plucking body parts out of yourself. But Jesus says if your hand causes you to stumble, cut that off and throw it from you. If your eye causes you to stumble, pluck that out and throw it from you. Because it's better for you to enter into life maimed than to not enter into it at all. But we're not willing to do that sometimes. True reform and true restoration in our life cannot exist unless we're willing not only to purge the sin that is in our life, but also the temptation that comes with it and that leads to it. In Ephesians, the 4th chapter, starting in verse 17, Paul says, so this I say and affirm together with the Lord, that you walk no longer as the Gentiles also walk, in the futility of their mind, being darkened in their understanding, excluded from the life of God, because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the hardness of their heart. And they, verse 19, having become callous, have given themselves over to sensuality for the practice of every kind of impurity with greediness. But you didn't learn Christ in this way, verse 20. If indeed you have heard him and have been taught in him, just as truth as in Jesus, that in reference to your former manner of life, you lay aside the old self, which is being corrupted in accordance with the lust of deceit, and that you be, verse 23, renewed in the spirit of your mind. Put on the new self, which in the likeness of God has been created in righteousness and holiness and the truth. Paul touches on the idea that true restoration and true renewal happens when we begin to renew our mind. Some Christians become Christians and they never really put off the things of this earth. They become Christians and they say, okay, I'm going to make an effort to be better now, which is great, but they never really make an effort to get some things out of their life that are causing those problems. And the true renewal and restoration begins in the mind. So where is the bad? And then ask yourself after that, where is the good in my life? This is all about establishing godly habits. This is a great sermon, hopefully, to have at the beginning of the year because we're all about habit setting, all about goal setting, that type of stuff. So ask yourself this morning, what godly habits can you install in your life? And I don't care if you're a new Christian, I don't care if you've been a Christian for 50 years, we can all do a little bit better. And we can all make resolutions and habits in our life to ask ourselves, or to say to ourselves, not only am I going to read the Bible every day, but I'm also going to meditate on it a little bit. I'm going to involve myself in other people's lives, like we talked about last week. I'm going to ask Scott to put me up for different duties, for instance. He got really worried when I said I'm going to ask Scott. I'm going to ask Scott to put me up for different duties because I want to stretch myself in public worship. I want to ask the deacons what else I can do around the church building. I want to ask the elders who I can visit throughout the week to encourage. I'm going to commit to being here on Wednesday nights. Whatever my godly habits are, whatever I feel like I'm deficient in, I'm going to make a concerted effort to be better in that. You know, we talk about attendance sometimes. And we usually use passages like Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 25 that say these people have a habit of avoiding worship. And if the Hebrew writer can say that avoiding worship is a habit, then we can also develop habits to do these types of things. We can create habits to be at worship on Wednesday. We can create habits to wake up every single day and start our day with prayer and with Bible study. We can create habits to get a little bit closer towards God. I love Proverbs chapter 27, verse 19. If you highlight or underline, this is a great one for you to commit to memory. Because in Proverbs 27 and verse 19, he says, as in water, face reflects face, so the heart of man reflects the man. You want to know where your true heart is every single day? Keep a log of your activities. And it doesn't have to be specific. Today at 9:37, I drank 18 ounces of water. I'm not talking about that necessarily. But keep a log of your activities. See how much time you spend on your phone. If you're like me, you probably will hate yourself after that. See how much time you spend on your phone. See how much time you spent talking to other people in text messages. See how much time you spent in prayer. See how much time you spent at work. See how much time you spent yourself in all these different activities. And you will see in your life what is truly the most important for you. Our lives reflect what's inside of our heart. And if we restore our heart, then it will be reflected in our life. Then finally ask yourself, where's the better? I asked Jay to read from Philippians chapter 1. We mentioned this, I think, last week, but I think it's so perfect for what we're talking about here. Look again at Philippians chapter 1. Philippians chapter 1, starting in verse 21. Philippians chapter 1, starting in verse 21. He says, "For to me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. But if I am to live on the flesh, this will mean fruitful labor for me, and I don't know which one to choose. But I am hard-pressed from both directions," verse 23, "having the desire to depart and be with Christ, for that is so much better. Yet to remain on the flesh is more necessary for your sake. Convinced of this, I know, and I will remain and continue with all for your progress and your joy in the faith, so that your proud confidence in me may abound in Christ Jesus through my coming to you again." Notice this decision that he has to make. On the one hand, he could go to heaven and be with God forever, which who doesn't want that, at least in their own time? Who doesn't want that to happen? But secondly, the opposite way is he could stay and hang out with these guys, some of which are awesome, some of which are probably not so awesome, but he could stay with them and he could work together with them in their stand for God. Which one is he going to choose? And yet at the end of these verses, it's a no-brainer, because as he says in 25 and 26, he knows that one of them is better. But notice what he says starting in verse 27. "Only conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or I remain absent, I will hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel, in no way alarmed by your opponents, which is a sign of destruction for them, but of salvation for you, and that too from God. For to you it has been granted to Christ's sake, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake, experiencing," verse 30, "the same conflict which you saw in me, and now here to be in me." Paul's decision in this passage, I don't think, gives nearly enough credit as he does. Because here he has two options, as we just talked about, laid out right in front of him. He has the option to depart and go be with Christ, which after given what he's been through, who wouldn't choose something like that? But the second option is to stay, be persecuted, be beaten down, still deal with people that are not always doing what they should be doing, as you see reflected in every letter. And yet the decision that he makes is to stand with them. But did you notice what he says in verses 27 through 30? "The only thing I ask of you," Paul says, "is that you stand firm with me." If I'm making the decision to not go and be with God, which is what he wants, and I'm making the decision to be here with you, then the least that you can do is meet me halfway. The least that you can do is not run in the face of persecution. The least that you can do is stand up in the face of trial and persecution and stand with me together as we fight towards God. We all, as Christians, if you're here this morning and you're a Christian, I saw a bunch of people reach for their songbooks. If you're here this morning, you've made a decision to be a Christian. You have at some point made a decision to stand with God. You've made that bold declaration of faith where I am going to stand up, I'm going to affirm my allegiance towards God, and I am going to carry on throughout him. And let me tell you something right now. That commitment gives me strength. Because when we're all out there in the world and we're all facing the different things that Christians deal with on an everyday basis, some of it catastrophic, most of it not nearly catastrophic, but we're all struggling with different things. What gives me courage is to know that I have 100 people by my side fighting that at the exact same time. That we've all made that same bold commitment in our life, that we will stand together with God. And that's where restoration finds its true fulfillment. Not just in rooting out the bad, the sin, and the temptation that needs to be out of our life that stops us, but also the good habits that we build every single day as we try and inch closer and closer to becoming made in his image. But also the better part of it is to make that commitment together. Josiah could not have had all these reforms that he did inside of Judah unless he had the backing of some very notable individuals, which we didn't have time to go through this morning. But he could not have done that himself. The only reason he was able to accomplish that is because of the people that were standing around him. And the only way that we are going to establish and create anything as Christians that's worthwhile is if we do it, ladies and gentlemen, together. I need you. You need me. We all need each other to make that commitment to stand firm for God. Now, if you're here this morning, you haven't become a Christian. You have this opportunity to make that commitment. You have the opportunity to raise your hand and say, I want to become a child of God. I want to stand firm. I want to fight for God. I want to be his child. And I want to stand alongside men like John McIntosh and Mike Reed and Paul Wood. I want to stand beside women like Coralie. I want to stand beside women like Jan and Patty Simon. I want to stand beside these people as we fight and we restore our lives back to what they should have been all along, which is to be created in his image. And if you need help with that, I ask you to come as we stand and as we sing.